afternoon. I want to dispel the rumor, however ridiculous and incomprehensible to me, that Professor Chomsky doesn't give us any ideas what to do. He just reports on the bad stuff from his informed perspective. That's not true at all. My goal is to provide to the lay public, from my non-intellectual basis as a lay follower of Noam's massive scholarship, this material, provided in a way that a middle school student, if not younger, should understand it. The first video in the series, Steps to Take, will lay the groundwork for someone to hear what Professor Chomsky is saying about activism. Noam has granted me the right to produce this series. I don't take the responsibility lightly. Please note that I borrowed video from public sources. These are Noam's interviews, but if given notice to withdraw them, I won't challenge the order, providing it is from an appropriate authority. In this series, we'll review material over many years of Noam scholarship. You'll see him as he is today at 93 and as he was 60 years ago, and at different times in between. I'm going to start with a recent book just published last year with Mary Waterstone called Consequences of Capitalism. I'm hoping the material will help anyone be equipped to spread the word and also even to urge our political representatives to consider Chomsky and Waterstone's critical map for a more just and sustainable society.
We continue our conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky about the state of the American empire. Unparalleled levels of global wealth and income inequality are fueling system breakdown and the rise of repressive and authoritarian regimes that revoke basic liberties, rule through fear and coercion, and speak in the toxic rhetoric of hate and violence. This descent into a species of corporate totalitarianism and the ecocide that accompanies it, threatening the human species and most other species with extinction, will only be halted, they argue, by radically reorganizing human societies, politically, economically, and culturally.
There's a huge part of the population which not only sees, but is deeply committed to an alternative reality which has no basis in fact and is entirely the opposite of all evidence, but they cling to it religiously. There's some really serious ills, bipartisan incidentally, although the Republicans have gone off the spectrum. Who was it who had to drink the hemlock? The man who was corrupting the youth of Athens by asking too many questions. We don't want that around, not in a free democracy like Athens, and pretty much the same up to the present. Is systematically
I urge my friends in the minority to stand with us on this bipartisan bill.
Government that works for the benefit of the population. This goes from workers' rights to pollution of the environment, rules for protecting consumers. I mean, anything you can think of is being dismantled. And all efforts are being devoted, kind of almost with fanaticism, to enrich and empower their actual constituency, which is super wealth and corporate power. The worst policies that he's carrying out, the most dangerous, are barely discussed. Those are the two existential threats that we face. You have to face the fact that humans are now in a situation which has never arisen in human history. This generation has to decide whether organized human existence is going to continue. And it's not a joke. It's global warming and nuclear war. I grew up in the 1930s, which was quite an interesting period. Some ways a little bit like today, in other ways quite different. Objectively, it was much harsher than today. So conditions during the Depression here in the United States were much worse than they are today. Subjectively, it was a much more optimistic period. Today, it's kind of striking to see the anger, hopelessness. I get a dozen letters every night from mostly young people saying, the world's awful, what can I do? It's hopeless. Take a look at the last election, November election. It was there were two striking aspects of it. One of them, not very startling, namely in the Republican primary, a person who was hated by the establishment, but who happens to be a billionaire, won the nomination. Okay, it's kind of a surprise, but not startling that a billionaire con man should win a nomination.
What do we need to do to amplify some of those alternative models to support them or protect them, given that we understand they're going to be antithetical and maybe potential targets of purveyors of the status quo? How do we help amplify those alternative models, and what's holding us back from seeing these different structures as things that we could do, as things that we all could do?
Well, first of all, we should recognize that there's some truth to the notion of American exceptionalism. By American, I don't mean the people of the United States. I mean the policies of the masters the masters of mankind, back to Adam Smith's formulation, who control government policies. So take something as simple as, say, maternity leave. If you look at polls, I forgot the exact numbers, but I think Americans favor it by about 90% or something like that. Well, turns out we're the only country, except for a couple of Pacific islands, that doesn't have maternity leave. Paid maternity leave. Of course, a woman can take off and starve if she likes, but literally, it's true. It's the United States and a half a dozen Pacific islands. You go to the next biggest country in the Western Hemisphere, Brazil, it's a poor country, 4 months of guaranteed paid maternity leave, supported ultimately by Social Security.